If you are here for Trade Justice's very first Trade Justice Power Hour on combating divisive trade myths and promoting cross-border solidarity, you are in the right place. I'm going to give folks a second to kind of trickle into the Zoom, and then we will get started. I want to welcome folks that are just joining us. If you're here for the first Trade Justice Power Hour on divisive trade myths and promoting cross-border solidarity, you're in the right place. Just want to say that we're going to get started in a second. I want to give folks a minute to trickle into the Zoom. All right, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started with just some introductory remarks. For folks who don't know me, I'm Hillary Hayden. I'm the organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund. We are a national nonprofit that's working on stopping the damage of corporate-centered trade deals and promoting a positive vision for international trade. These Trade Justice Power Hour calls are taking the place of our more IPEF-focused activist calls that we had last year. So if you're joining us from that space, I want to welcome you. I also want to welcome new folks. I will flag quickly that these calls are not intended as press briefings. So if you're a member of the press and you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me separately, but this is not the place for press questions. So just by way of an agenda today, I'm going to give some intro and framing for our conversation, and then I'll introduce each of our three amazing speakers. As we head deeper and deeper into 2024, it's likely that we'll hear more and more divisive rhetoric about trade from political candidates, from media outlets, and on Facebook and other social media platforms. A lot of these hot takes about trade at their core are going to be designed to try to pit working people in the United States against working people in other countries. For example, if the recent past is any guide, one of the major themes we're almost certain to hear this year is that other countries somehow got the better of the US in past trade negotiations. This is a common refrain about trade policy that a lot of you have probably heard. But this idea that other countries somehow got the better of the US in past trade negotiations, which is often framed as the US versus foreigners, often ends with the misleading proposal that we finally just need to put America first in our trade policy. And this whole story that we're being told isn't really based in reality. It's a false narrative that intentionally erases two important facts. First, it erases the fact that US-based corporations are the one who push the rules found in most trade deals, and those corporations have benefited tremendously from the rules as they are. And the second one is that this claim erases the fact that working people in other countries haven't benefited from these trade deals either. Like a lot of American workers abroad have seen their livelihoods destroyed under trade deals like NAFTA, CAFTA, and other agreements as well. This US versus the world type of rhetoric appeals in its very best light to people's love of country, right? To their patriotism. And in its worst light, it appeals to people's fear of what's foreign to them, and often makes flat out appeals to xenophobia and racism. And this lie that's being told is one that benefits those at the top and hurts the rest of us in that it serves as a distraction. It distracts us from who really benefits from business as usual trade policy, which is big pharma, big oil, big tech, big ag, other corporations. And in doing so, it distracts us from real fair trade solutions. Instead, it points us towards xenophobic trade policy proposals that continue to benefit US corporations, but for the most part, leave our communities in a lurch. Toward the end of this briefing, I'm going to come back on and suggest a few principles for solidarity-based trade alternatives that improve labor and environmental conditions for everyone. We believe that one of the best ways to protect jobs and improve wages at home is by leveraging trade policy and American economic power to stand in solidarity with workers in other countries and demanding improvements to their own working conditions and environmental standards, and demanding those kinds of improvements here at home as well. But before I go there, I want to first introduce three amazing presenters that are going to help set the context for this discussion by talking about some of the realities of trade impacts abroad and some of the consequences of racist trade rhetoric here at home. So first up today, we're going to hear from Elena Lopez, who's the Senior Legislative Specialist at the Communication Workers of America. Elena is going to talk about her union's approach to cross-border worker solidarity in the face of offshoring. Next, we'll hear from Vicki Gass. Vicki is the Executive Director of the Latin America Working Group. She's worked on Central American social and economic justice issues since 1984 and has lived in El Salvador and Honduras. Prior to working at LOG, she worked at Oxfam and the Washington Office on Latin America with a focus on human rights, economic development and trade, migration, fiscal reform and tax justice policies, gender equity, climate change, and sustainable agroecology in U.S. policy. Vicki's going to provide an overview of the role that bad trade policies have played in migration from Latin America. And third, we'll hear from Will Wiltschko. He's the director at the California Trade Justice Coalition. Will's going to talk about the rise in anti-Asian hate across the country and the dangers of trade rhetoric that's based in xenophobia and other kinds of racism and xenophobia. Once all our presenters have had the chance to speak, there will be an opportunity for your questions too. So please put those questions in the Q&A as we go along, and we'll have time to address them at the end. I'm going to close us out in a little under an hour with some suggested action items. And I think with that, Elena, I will pass it to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Hillary. Hi, everyone. My name is Elena Lopez, and I'm a senior legislative specialist here at the Communication Workers of America, CWA. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this Trade Justice Power Hour, the best kind of power hour, to really learn about the importance of promoting fair trade policy alternatives. CWA understands the importance of promoting cross-border solidarity and ensuring that all of us across the globe are uniting as one against the corporate powers that attempt to divide us. For those who aren't familiar with our union, CWA represents workers in the telecommunication industries, manufacturing, tech, and so many more industries. And over the years, our union has seen call centers and factories, tech, video game development, and other jobs across all our industries shift operation overseas, downsize, or shut down their U.S. operations altogether. And as a result, these local communities and entire regions are devastated when these jobs are offshored. In many cases, this happens because companies know that they can move jobs overseas and profit off the exploitation of workers in countries where the struggle to organize can be a matter of life and death. At CWA, we've heard stories from our friends and allies in the Philippines about the persecution, the attacks, the red tagging, which is being falsely accused of being a communist or a terrorist, or both in some cases, of labor activists and human rights defenders. Our union and the broader U.S. labor movement knows that we cannot fight for our own dignity and rights here without helping our brothers and sisters and siblings abroad, that our fight for better wages and working conditions are directly related and connected to whether workers across the globe can organize. So CWA has had a long-standing relationship with workers in the Philippines, and we have worked together over a number of years on many issues. It really started in 2016 when our union was on strike at Verizon Communications. During that strike, many of the customer service calls were routed from outsourced call centers here in the US to the Philippines. And when the Filipino workers learned about our strike, the BPO Industry Employees Network, BN, reached out to CWA to let us know that call center workers there in the Philippines didn't want to be scabbed, and they wanted to know how they could help us in our fight with Verizon management. Striking CWA members then traveled to the Philippines to meet with workers there and stage solidarity actions at call centers that were handling the calls being routed from struck U.S. call centers. Given, the persecution of labor activists in the country, it was truly a brave act of solidarity of those workers and really resulted in a growing partnership between our groups that continue to this day. And since that initial demonstration of international solidarity from our brothers and sisters in the Philippines, we have focused on deepening those bonds of global solidarity. In 2019, another group of CWA workers and local leaders traveled to the Philippines to meet with Filipino call center workers and union leaders. They heard firsthand accounts of how Filipino workers who participated in any union activity were subjected to physical threats and severe intimidation. They met with Ann Kruger, a union organizer, who showed our members around Manila and hosted a group of them in her home during their stay. Shortly after their visit, Ann's union office and a number of union offices across the country were raided by the police, and she was arrested under false charges, all because of her union activity. They also met with Sarah, who shared how her and her partner were heavily involved in their organizing campaign and the fight for better wages at their company. Sadly, they weren't able to meet her partner because he was arrested and in jail at the time due to his union activity. To this day, our members still talk about how impactful and eye-opening the trip was and how they continue to share the stories from the Filipino call center workers of those stories to the members of their union. And we have been horrified to continue to learn about the harmful conditions that workers wanting to organize in the Philippines face. In fact, the Philippines has been named by the International Trade Union Confederation for 4 years in a row one of the world's worst countries for working people because trade unionists are killed, subjected to violence, arrested, and consistently red tagged. 2 years ago, we saw the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Philippines National Police perform a series of raids that led to the murder of 9 labor and human rights defenders and the arrest of 6 others. This reality became even more direct for CWA when Alex De La Rosa, an organizer funded through support from CWA, was brutally murdered last year for his union activities. Alex was a union organizer and paralegal with BIEN, as well as a social justice and LGBTQ plus rights activist. For us, Alex was a bigger part of our CWA family, and his death has shaken us all. And the sad truth is that Alex's murder is not unique. His tragic and senseless murder follows years of him being surveilled and red tagged by the government of the Philippines. At one point, he was harassed while entering the BN offices, and he felt so threatened that he had to flee. Alex lived with this persecution for standing up for his rights. And even in this death, the red tagging did not stop. Shortly after his murder, the red tagging of him and BN took off on social media. It was truly horrifying. And his brutal murder happened in the context of these larger attacks on workers' rights fighting for change. This sorts of targeting leaves a chilling effect on labor activists and their work, which puts downward pressure on wages and working conditions in the US too. Companies can and do exploit the low wages, substandard working conditions, and lack of respect for collective bargaining rights in other countries. US companies often treat sourcing like a game of whack-a-mole, right? Jumping from country to country when strengthened and enforced labor laws drive workers' pay closer to a living wage. We have seen giant telecom companies prey on the Filipino workforce. These workers are getting paid less than $2 an hour and don't have basic rights to organize. A corporation sees those factors and knows that they can profit off the exploitation, and then they move our well-paid union jobs with benefits overseas. And that is why global labor solidarity is so important, because our struggles for better working conditions, better wages, and better unions are all connected. And you'll find that when you talk to union members and American workers, they get it. It resonates with them. They all understand that we have a goal, the common goal of fighting against corporate greed and putting power back into the hands of workers. And it's important that we as American workers get involved because we face many of the same struggles that workers abroad face. So when we talk about trade or negotiate trade deals, workers must have a seat at the table to determine their conditions of labor. Our trade policies should recognize the crucial role that workers play around the world to achieve social and economic equity. Doing so will lift labor standards domestically and internationally, and importantly, will do so by giving workers that crucial seat at the table. As the cliche saying goes, right? A rising tide lifts all boats. We cannot let multinational corporations and greed divide us. Workers across the globe are in this together. And when we stand together and fight through the struggle together, we all win. By centering our policies of workers globally, we can strengthen economic security at home by combating the race to the bottom, where companies move our good-paying union jobs overseas so that they can exploit international workers who are threatened, intimidated, abused, and killed for organizing. Workers in the Philippines and across the globe must be free to exercise their right to form and join unions without fear of death or retaliation by their own government. CWA and the U.S. labor movement will continue to stand behind these workers and ensure that domestic and international worker rights are front and center when we talk about trade or make a trade deal. And we will make sure to let our members know and understand the benefits of what cross-border solidarity can do for them and workers globally. Thank you guys so much for listening, and look forward to any questions that you may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elena. I've long been really inspired by the CWA's work in the Philippines, so I really appreciate you being willing to share some of that with our audience today. Vicki, are you ready? You're on mute, Vicki.
Yep, I'm ready.
Go for it.
Great. First of all, I want to thank Hillary and the Trade Justice Education Fund for inviting me here to speak today. Again, my name is Vicki Gass. I work with the Latin America Working Group. The Latin America Working Group is a human rights organization that advocates for just and rights-based U.S. policies towards Latin America. And as Hillary mentioned, I have over 30 years working in Latin America with a specific focus on Mexico and Central America. I wanted to start off just with sort of a little anecdote. When I started, when I was doing work around the DR-CAFTA in the mid-early 2000s, I remember doing debates with a woman named Lori Wallach, who used to work with Public Citizen as their global trade person. And we were on panels together to talk about some of the pitfalls about these trade agreements. And Lori would walk into the room with a piece of paper in one hand and an armful of books holding all the rules and regulations and laws governing the trade deals in her other arm. And she would argue that if there were really, these were really free trade agreements, all you had to do was sign a single piece of paper saying that all trade is free and leave it at that, rather than having this huge stack of books of rules and regulations. The thing is, there is no such thing as free trade. What you have is unprecedented free movement of goods over borders, regulated in quantity and quality by the trade agreements. And this doesn't obviously apply to free movement of people, of workers who pick the crops for export, for example, or people who are displaced because of the trade agreements and expansion of monocrops, such as African palm. DR-CAFTA, like other trade agreements before and after it, according to U.S. trade negotiators, was to level the playing field and be, not to quote Ellen exactly, but to be the tide that lifts all boats. But the reality is it tilted the playing field even further in favor of the U.S. and multinational corporations. And it certainly hasn't been the tide that lifts all boats. So here we are in 2024, post-pandemic, which of course had an impact. But you have record levels of immigration from the hemisphere arriving at the border seeking a better life. And I can tell you this isn't just single men who are looking to earn a decent salary and send back the remittances to their families back in their home countries. But today it's whole families who are escaping poverty, climate change, violence, lack of economic opportunity, and poor healthcare and education. It's also important to point out that it's not only from this hemisphere, but it's also around the globe of people who are coming to the border. You also see, rather than growing democracy in the region and healthy democratic institutions, you have an increasing trend towards authoritarianism in Central America, especially thinking of Nicaragua and El Salvador. in El Salvador, where recently there have been attacks and jailings of union workers who have been protesting the government of Nayib Bukele. You also have here in the United States a shortage of workers. You have a system where the violations of labor rights is not held to the same standard as violations of commercial agreements. In fact, commercial agreements is much more egregious according to the laws of these trade agreements than any labor rights such as lack of pay, injury on the job, etc. You also see a system where remittances are sustaining governments in the region. In El Salvador, for instance, you have 24 of the government's GDP, 24%, excuse me, of the GDP is coming from remittances, and in Guatemala, 33% of the GDP is coming from remittances. And it's really clear that these governments are relying on the remittances to allow their citizens to eke out a subsistence that they can't provide for in their own countries. So free trade is a misnomer. It's misleading. The free trades of the last the free trade agreements, I should say, of the last 4 decades have provided preferential treatment to prominent corporations and businesses in affluent nations at the expense of emerging nations and small entrepreneurs. I wanted to talk about 3 or 4 points in the trade agreements that sort of outline what I just said. First is the intellectual property rights. It's common in all the free trade agreements. It benefits industrialized nations who already have access to technology and other inputs, as opposed to counterparts in emerging countries. And it limits these intellectual property rights regulations, limits government's ability to achieve their own development goals. You also have the investor-state dispute settlements. These are so-called settlements that provides the capacity to erode the national sovereignty of a country. It allows a company to sue the government, not the business, but the government. It demonstrates partiality towards multinational corporations at the expense of domestic businesses. It provides foreign investors expanded protection rights that surpass those rights that are enshrined in the constitution of the different countries. And just to give you an example of that, we're working on a case right now in Honduras with the zones of economic development, otherwise known as ZERES. And what the ZERES do is create these gated communities where the people within those communities are able to make their own laws and regulations, have their own police force, have their own environmental standards, have their own labor standards, and be outside or apart from the laws and the constitution of Honduras. And the Honduran government has said no, originally has said that no, we don't want this, and passed a law that's saying no to ZERES. And the companies behind the ZERES, this particular ZERES, is suing the Honduran government under the investor-state dispute settlement clause for a suit that would be the cost of 2/3 of its national budget. So imagine if they win, and 2/3 of the country's national budget has to go pay off this small enclave that abides to its own rules and nobody else's. And this is just one of many dispute settlements cases that have been going on. A third is the government procurement. And as you know, government procurement deals with how governments purchase goods and services. And what the trade agreements do is require equitable treatment to be given to suppliers from other countries. So an example of that, if you have a small incubator computer company in El Salvador and trying to go up against Apple, Apple will be able to provide its materials and its product at a much lower rate than incubator business in El Salvador. So it's preferential treatment for foreign companies. It's also a race to the bottom for labor and safety issues, because whoever offers the lowest price can win. A final point is the anti-corruption provisions to prevent corruption in the public sector. This has failed completely. Corruption is rampant throughout Central America, especially, and yet we continue to trade with these countries. And I just want to give you an example of Nicaragua, which since 2018 has moved towards a dictatorship. It's painful for me to say that as somebody who started out in Nicaragua in the early 80s. But they have expelled people, they've expelled NGOs, poverty is rampant. The difference is that trade between the United States and Nicaragua has quadrupled 4 times over the last, since 2018, since the problems began in that country, which goes to show you that what really is the most important is that trade isn't interrupted. So the trade agreements are not a development strategy. It's a legal document that benefits foreign companies at the expenses of the countries we are trading with. And today you'll see the United States government is prioritizing private investments in Central America to resolve the crisis of the migrants coming to the border. And they'll tell you this isn't going to happen overnight. That's what they'll say, and they'll keep saying to you. But I can tell you that this is the same message we received 20 years ago when we were debating DR-CAFTA, and they said this would be the tide that lifted all boats. It's not. It's not a development strategy. It's failing, and it's failing on several fronts, and it's forcing the people to make painful decisions to leave their homes in search of a life, a living. So I know that Hillary is going to talk about some of the points about solidarity, but I wanted to emphasize the needs for solidarity among workers, unionized or not. We need to all fight for a living wage and better working conditions. We really need to reclaim local and state governments, both here and in other countries. We need to promote local, sustainable and inclusive economies. An example of that would be for schools in a school district to buy their food for their cafeterias from local producers. And last of all, we need to understand our commonalities, our similar conditions, and work together rather than being divided. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I want to remind folks quickly to put questions for our presenters in the Q&A. We will have time for a few of those. And now I want to turn to Will. Go ahead, Will.
Hi, I'm Jamil Wiltschko. I'm the director of the California Trade Justice Coalition. We're a coalition of labor unions, environmental groups, and human rights organizations focused on advancing trade policies that uplift people and the planet. So the points I'm here to make today are pretty straightforward and hopefully obvious. And the first point I really want to make is that folks are upset about job offshoring and wage suppression and other negative consequences of U.S. trade policy, but much of that anger gets misdirected. This has led to an increase in hate crimes targeting people, especially in the Bay Area, people of Chinese descent in the United States, and other folks in the AAPI community. And the folks who are being targeted often are elderly folks, are obviously not responsible for these policies. The Chinese government and other Asian governments are also not responsible for U.S. trade policies. And so to be clear about who is responsible for bad trade deals, it's U.S.-based corporations and the U.S. politicians that serve them. But the finger never stays pointed at them for long, right? Instead, we have politicians blaming, quote unquote, China. The racist scapegoating in trade policy is something that obviously exploded during the original Trump campaign back in 2016, but it predates that. Politicians have been using rhetoric that blames Asian countries and Asian people for US economic woes for a long time. Now, a classic example, of course, was all the bashing of Japan and Japanese-made goods in the early 1980s. Among other things, that created an environment in which two auto workers stalked and beat an Asian American man named Vincent Chin to death with a baseball bat after they made anti-Japanese comments. He was Chinese American. They didn't even get his ethnicity right. The killers didn't do time for the murder. Instead, they received a $3,000 fine and 3 years probation. The judge explained they weren't the kind of men you send to jail. And one would ask, if those aren't the kind of men you send to jail, then who are the kind of men you send to jail? And Vincent Chin was supposed to be married a few days later, and so instead his fiance and his family buried him, and they never really got justice. And this was before a lot of our time. I was born in 1991, but I wish I could say things have improved dramatically in the years since the 1980s. But during the Trump administration, a Pew study found that over 80% of Asian American adults believed that violence against Asian Americans was on the rise in their communities, and that roughly a third personally feared being threatened or physically attacked. And I'll say that in the Bay Area, in California, a lot of folks from different AAPI communities, my own community included, we feel that we're going to be targeted. There's always that sense in the back of your head that, is someone just going to attack me just because they can, and they could tie it to some politician's, statement. The group Stop AAPI Hate has also reported significant rises in anti-Asian hate crimes since it started tracking the hard data in 2020, including everything from harassment to vandalism to physical assault. An example of the latter, not too far from me, was I think a lot of folks probably saw this video, but a 75-year-old woman named Zhao Zhanji was brutally beaten amongst a wave of attacks on Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans in California in recent years. And I don't know if you recall this video, but it's an elderly woman being attacked and, basically crying, like, why are you attacking me? And when you have politicians saying that China is, quote unquote, raping the United States and blaming China for things without acknowledging that the trade policies we're talking about were put in place not by the Chinese government, but by the US government at US corporations' demand, that contributes to this racial hatred and scapegoating. One thing that really stuck out to me was that perpetrators of these hate acts towards Asians and Asian Americans often repeat the rhetoric they hear from candidates and elected officials, blaming China for public health crises, for economic downturns, and for national security concerns. So they repeat the rhetoric that they hear while they're attacking folks, while they're vandalizing, while they're doing these things. And another obvious point that I really want to make here is that it's okay to criticize governments for specific actions, but it's not okay to lump all people together when talking about those actions. It seems like a no-brainer, and yet it continually happens. If a politician is going to criticize, let's say, human rights abuses, are they actually doing anything to support people from that country fighting against those abuses, or are they just doing more scapegoating? Now, we heard from Elena earlier how CWA isn't just complaining about human rights abuses in the Philippines. They're working to support Filipino workers on the front lines of fighting those abuses. That's the right thing to do. Rhetoric that lumps all Filipinos together for the abusive actions of their government and that tries to scapegoat them for the offshoring done by US corporations is the wrong thing to do. And that's often what we see from politicians who are talking about Asia, particularly, but not only with regards to China. That scapegoating makes life a lot harder for Asian Americans. It leads to increases in harassment and violence. And also, I should mention, it makes it easier for politicians to get away with a lot of backhanded hypocrisy. In 2020, Trump was negotiating a US-China trade deal. The guy had been bashing China as responsible for job offshoring and other economic problems for years. He's still doing that now. But if you look at the details of that trade deal that he was working on with China, there was nothing in there about worker rights abuses or abuse of ethnic minorities in China or anything else even suggesting some interest in trying to address ongoing human rights abuses. Instead, the policy written into the detail was about protecting the so-called rights of U.S. corporations doing business in China, protecting investor rights and intellectual property rights so that U.S. firms can feel safer moving jobs there. And that's what you get when you have politicians bashing foreign governments and Asian people in general without any spotlight on the type of policies they're actually promoting. And we need to do much better. And unfortunately, it's not just Donald Trump who's spewing this type of racial hatred. It comes from politicians across party lines. And we need to call them out when we see it. Pitting working people against each other only serves the interest of the 1%, of the folks who actually get to write and be in the room when trade policies are being made in our names. They want to pit working people in the United States against working people in China, Mexico, and the Philippines against each other and have us ignore the real enemy. And we can't let such rhetoric go unanswered this election cycle. When you see people falling for those lines, when you see people making those statements, call them out. Ask some questions. In your workspaces, your unions, with other folks, the point is point out that it's not just working people versus it's working people, it's working people everywhere versus these corporations and these politicians who seek to undermine our interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will, for that important intervention. I want to quickly recap some of what we just heard before we go to Q&A. So first, we heard that working people in Asia, in the Philippines, who should, in theory, be benefiting from these once good-paying U.S. jobs that were shipped to their countries, instead of benefiting, they're having their basic rights violently denied to them and are being exploited as a result, or some of them earning pennies on the dollar in comparison to U.S. workers. Second, we heard about several impacts of trade deals like NAFTA and CAFTA that have impacted farmers and communities across Latin America. And these situations have resulted in millions of people moving to the U.S. in search of a better life for their families. Third, we heard that the anger stoked against all the job offshoring and wage suppression in the United States that has been caused by bad trade deals hasn't been directed at CEOs and lobbyists who pushed for that system of rules in the first place, but rather it's being directed toward Asian Americans, leading to a surge in hate crimes and violence. In sum, the way that the trade debate is commonly framed in the US is ignoring a huge part of who's hurt by business as usual trade agreements, and it's ignoring who's responsible for these rules in the first place. And when you ignore these pieces of the puzzle, it's easy to get steered towards scapegoating and false solutions. I'm going to take a minute now to describe one of the core tenets of what we think is a positive solution, a set of trade rules that's based on cross-border solidarity. One of the key functions of trade agreements relative to other international agreements that makes them powerful and effective is that trade agreements typically include built-in enforcement mechanisms. So if a country violates a human rights treaty, 99 times out of 100 times, there aren't really consequences for doing so. If a country violates an environmental treaty, virtually 100 times out of 100 times, there's no consequence for doing so. But if a country violates the binding obligations within a trade agreement, it can be held to account through a variety of specific spelled out processes that can result in the country facing millions and in some instances, even billions of dollars worth of penalties. It's a pretty big stick that encourages countries to live up to trade agreement rules. So the problem, of course, is that most of the rules that we have in place now are crap rules that were written in the interest of big corporations. They're not designed to help foreign countries. They're designed to help big pharma, big ag, big tech, Walmart and Wall Street, all right here in the United States. And that's why, for us, we say that America First is not really good enough. Policies that help American companies may or may not end up benefiting American workers and American communities. They certainly aren't right now in this moment. What we want to do is get rid of corporate-driven rules that put corporations first at the expense of working people on the planet. And we want to insert rules that help working people across borders. We want things like strong labor standards, strong environmental standards, and we want those standards backed up with enforcement mechanisms that until recently, and I saw a question about this, which we'll get to in the Q&A, were only used to enforce special rights for corporations. If you want to get a little bit into the weeds of what that looks like, it could be an expansion of the rapid response mechanism that's built into the labor chapter of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. A version of this mechanism was advocated for by US and Mexican labor and civil society folks, and it essentially allows fines or import bans to be placed on imported goods and services made under conditions that violate basic labor standards. That system, which has been used by independent unions in Mexico to get their rights respected, does need to be improved upon and expanded to help enforce other kinds of standards as well. But the core concept here is to start using trade agreements to lift working conditions and environmental conditions around the world. If we help protect workers' rights abroad, we can start removing the incentive for companies to ship good-paying jobs overseas. If we help increase people's purchasing power abroad, we create new markets for US exports, which helps workers at home too. And more than that, it's just simply the right thing to do. It's something valuable in and of itself if you're a decent human being. But the thing that takes it beyond charity and into solidarity is the recognition that this is the best way to protect good-paying jobs and increase wages at home too. It's a win for workers at home and abroad. It's a win for the environment. And the only reason that this kind of policy hasn't been enacted far and wide is, of course, that it is not an immediate win for big corporations. They believe that they can make more money through exploiting workers and the environment abroad. And part of the way that they continue with that is by pushing trade narratives that obscure their role in creating and profiting from that status quo. So in a second, I'm going to share some concrete action steps that help explain what you can do this year when you hear misleading trade rhetoric. But before we go there, I want to continue encouraging folks to put questions in the Q&A. And we are going to turn to questions that folks have for the panelists. I think the one that I want to start with is actually probably for you, Elena. So a question that both was direct message to me and then one that's in the Q&A kind of gets at what does the educational program look like for rank and file membership? How do you talk to them about these issues? And what advice do you have for labor folks that might be joining about talking to membership about trade issues and international solidarity?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think for us, it's really important to have member-to-member, face-to-face conversations about this, right? Like me preaching to the choir or me preaching to our membership is helpful, but when they hear from like directly from their local president or, the guy who works on the shop with them, it just matters so much more, right? Like they can have those face-to-face conversations and connect on a deeper level than, someone who is just coming to talk to them at a webinar about this. It's a great first step, but, I think really making it real for them and making it, personal just matters so much more. So we try to encourage our membership to, have these conversations face to face. And it was really helpful that, we actually had members go to the Philippines and, talk to members, talk to Filipino workers there who shared those stories because it just made it that much more real. So we really try, to, I think, bring Filipino call center workers when we can to the US to speak to our membership, whether it's at our LP conference or, a couple lobbying days. So they have those interactions so they understand kind of what's at stake. And then hopefully the goal is, right, then our members remember meeting Mylene, who's the president of BN, who I've met many times. I love her dearly, but she's met with a lot of our membership and they talk about oh, how is Mylene doing, right? What's going on in the Philippines? How can we help her? And so having kind of those conversations that they can take back to their own membership and say look, right? It's not us against them. Mylene just wants to be able to work in the call center and take our calls and help people out, but she has to hide, while doing that. She doesn't feel safe being at home with her family. And I think, just having those face-to-face conversations makes it so much more real.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elena. That's super helpful. The next question that I would like to address from the Q&A is actually for Vicki. Vicki, we have a question from Mary. She's relatively new to trade policy work, and she's wondering if you have recommendations for books or articles on the impact of trade in the global South and the impact especially of investor-state dispute settlement.
Oh gosh, Mary, I don't know where to begin on that one, but what I think I will do is put my email in the chat and ask you to email me, and I can put together a really good list for you. Would that be okay? And anybody else who is interested?
That's totally fine. I will mention quickly for you, Mary, that some of the most influential books when I first started doing this work, there's one book called Eating NAFTA that talks a lot about how NAFTA altered some of the food systems in Mexico specifically, but a little bit of a deep dive into Latin America. And there's another good book by David Bacon called The Right to Stay Home, which is really good. I also have articles on ISDS, but I would have to look them up. I can't name drop them here in quite the same way. Amazing. There's one other question that was direct message to me. I'm going to go grab it really quick. So one other question that came up is, are there any trade agreements that have dispute mechanisms for labor rights similar to the investor state dispute settlement tribunals? And I kind of got at this in my comments, but the during the USMCA negotiations, that's the new NAFTA, as some people referred to it as it was being negotiated, we did get a tool called the rapid response mechanism. There were in the original NAFTA some side agreements that addressed labor rights and what would happen, but workers would file and it would take years and years and years for them to come to any kind of solution over whatever happened. So the rapid response mechanism is pretty surgical, honestly. It allows for a panel of folks, I think that all three countries agree on, to look at specific instances down to the factory level at companies that are violating people's labor rights and addressing them. It does need to be, like I said, expanded and improved upon, but it's the first time that we've seen, basically it's the first time that we've seen any kind of tool in trade policy result in workers actually getting the right to organize, getting workers actually represented by a union. And I think there's something like 18 of those cases that have been filed in Mexico since the new NAFTA, the USMCA as it's called, was put in place.
Can I add to that, Haley?
Of
Because
course.
I've talked to people here in DC from the Solidarity Center, and Elena, you might also have an opinion as well. But I'm hearing that the how did you put it, the new NAFTA, the labor clauses are actually quite strong, and you can address some of the more egregious labor rights. And similarly with the environmental, but that's only one agreement. And as you know, we're looking at DR-CAFTA here and how we might bring that same language to that. I think it's going to be an uphill battle because, as you said yourself, I mean, they're very weak. They take years. And they have no teeth. So, yeah, I don't know, Elena, have you heard anything about the new clauses?
I have not, but I think to your point, right, I think, and Hillary's point, like the rapid response mechanism is historic, right? That we've never had something like this in a trade agreement where we have like seen actual results. And you're correct, Vicki, it is just one agreement. But that's why we need to continue to fight, right? To make sure that all our agreements, CAFTA, NAFTA, whatever alphabet soup acronym that you want to name under the sun, like include something like this where we can have labor protections, environmental protections, you know, for all these issues that we care about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So I think I want to be sure that we have time to talk about the action steps. So I'm going to turn to that now. So we all know that we're going to hear a lot of divisive trade rhetoric this year from political candidates in our social media feeds, on the news, and possibly even in our homes and organizations. We want to be sure that everyone is prepared with the tools that they need to challenge that divisive messaging as it comes up and promote trade justice alternatives instead. So there are two ways that we're going to be asking folks to do that. The first one, I think that Clayton is going to paste this in the chat for everyone, but we have an activist toolkit for combating trade myths and promoting cross-border solidarity. That is a PDF that you can download and save right now that has some useful tools in it that I'm going to talk about right now. So the first is a fact sheet for calibrating your trade bullshit detector. It lists a number of things to watch out for in the trade debate, as well as arguments for countering them. This is a great thing for all of us to read up on, but it may also be a useful handout for organizational meetings or other places that you hear people parroting divisive trade rhetoric. Another fact sheet in the toolkit defines basic approaches to trade policy making, explaining the differences between neoliberalism, nationalism, and true global justice approaches to trade policy. And then super usefully, there's a social media toolkit with memes and images you can download and use either in response to crap about trade that you see on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or even that you can post proactively to help educate your followers before it gets to that. There's also a letter to the editor writing toolkit with not only points on these specific issues, but general tips on how to actually get those letters published. This is going to be a living document. We're going to keep updating it over the course of the year. But again, I want to encourage you to download that, check it out, read it, start using it right now. That's the first ask. The second and even more important ask that I have for folks in this space is to join our Trade Justice Rapid Response Team. If you sign up for that, we're going to reach out in specific moments that we need your help posting things on social media. We might reach out wanting you to submit a letter to the editor or help distribute a new fact sheet or a palm card. We'll also make sure that you're invited to these calls, which are going to keep happening once a month, where you can hear from national and international experts like we've heard from today, and share your ideas and report backs on what you're encountering in the trade debate in your community and how we can make a difference. So the link for that rapid response team is also in the chat. So please take a second to sign up for that now. And as you do, I want to see if our presenters have any closing comments they'd like to share. Elena, Vicki, Will, anything you'd like to leave our audience with? Vicki, I think you're talking, but you're on mute. Thank you.
Sorry, solidarity is key, and it's within communities and populations and between populations. The work that I did in El Salvador and Nicaragua in the 80s and bringing people from these countries to talk to unions, to churches, to community groups really breaks down barriers. That it's that people-to-people contact and where you see each other's humanity and that we're more alike than we are different. And get involved at the local and state level. I mean, look, the right is way ahead of us on that. And they've captured school boards and local governments and state governments. And we need to reclaim that space that's ours and it's the people's. And it has to go across the border, across the country, not just, blue versus red states. I'll stop there.
No, that's a great point. And I think, having those face-to-face conversations, whether it's with your coworkers or your community and, getting out there, talking to other communities, it really helps humanize the point to folks and understanding that, right, we're all in this struggle together. It's not us against them. It's multinational corporations trying to divide us so they can profit off of us. And we really need to stand together in order to protect each other from exploitation.
I think it's important that so many folks came out today to talk about trade. It's always inspiring to me that this many people show up in the middle of the day to just talk about trade. But yeah, it's really about having those hard conversations, but also seeing a better future and envisioning a better future for all of us. And, in a lot of ways, we've won so many things in the last few years in the trade justice movement. The fact that there's any labor, enforcement mechanism in the USMCA is because of a lot of the hard work that's happened from activists and folks all around our movement. And it shows that when we work together and we build together, we could really win. And so I want folks to take that with them.
Awesome. I want to thank our panelists, Will, Elena, and Vicki. You have been amazing. Super helpful context and lived experience for the conversation this afternoon. I want to let folks know that there will be a follow-up email that has a recording. So for all the folks messaging asking if there's a recording, the answer is yes, there will be a recording. And it will come in a follow-up email tomorrow with a few resources, including the ones here and other ones if Elena, Vicki, or Will, you have things that you'd like to share with attendees. And I want to thank folks for attending. Like Will said in the middle of the day, we are really looking forward to continuing this conversation and really looking forward to seeing some of you again in February. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.